Little could anyone know that the privileged child they called Graham would help spark an entire musical movement. Graham Parsons merged country, rock, folk, gospel, and soul in a way that few had ever dared, shaping something he once called cosmic American music. Behind that dreamy stare, though, was a life rocked by tragedy, marked by restlessness, and woven with a fierce desire to find belonging. His story is a tapestry of contrasts: rural Florida oranges and the glitz of Beverly Hills, the seriousness of Harvard's halls, and the smoky corners of late-night jam sessions, heartbreak ballads on the Grand Ole Opry stage, and wild nights with the Rolling Stones. Over it all hung a cloud of addiction, sorrow, and a search for spiritual meaning, one that ultimately led him into the wide open spaces of the California desert, never to return. To understand how Graham Parsons became the artist he was, you have to step back into the cultural swirl of mid-20th century America. The late 1940s and 50s saw the country buoyed by post-war optimism, but still recovering from deep wounds. Suburbs sprang up, and rock and roll was about to rattle the mainstream. Television sets were moving into living rooms, and Nashville's Grand Ole Opry was going strong, championing the old guard of country music. Social norms were shifting, and the young generation was itching for something new, something that broke the mold of their parents' world. By the early 1960s, the folk revival was in full swing. Civil rights movements were challenging the status quo, and rock bands were electrifying teenagers from coast to coast. It was an era of change, possibility, and tension. Born on November 5th, 1946, as Cecil Ingram Connor III in Winter Haven, Florida, Graham was the product of a wealthy family rooted in the citrus business. His mother, Avis Snively, was the heiress of the Snively Groves fortune, and his father, Cecil Coondog Connor, was a decorated Wabaupawi pilot who carried the scars of war well beyond the battlefield. Graham grew up in a world of big houses, abundant resources, and outward stability, but beneath the gleaming surface lay darkness. Graham was only 12 when his father died by suicide on Christmas morning of 1958. That single event would mark him forever, a raw wound that shaped his sense of life's fragility and the tragedies hidden within even the most privileged homes. After his father's death, Graham's mother remarried Robert Parsons, and in time Graham took his stepfather's surname. This is how Cecil Ingram Connor III became Graham Parsons. His mother, meanwhile, battled alcoholism, and young Graham watched helplessly as another person he loved began to slip away. In fact, on the day of his high school graduation, his mother died from complications related to her drinking. He was still in his teens, grappling with two profound losses that cut deeply into the bedrock of his emotional life. If there was a single thread Graham could cling to, it was music. Early on, he was enthralled by the feral energy of Elvis Presley. Family friends recall him as a kid, glued to the television whenever Elvis appeared, mesmerized by the way a simple rockabilly tune could spark an entire room into excitement. By his teens, Graham was playing in local bands like the Pacers and the Legends, performing covers of rock and roll hits at sock hops and small clubs. Even then, he was unafraid to blend styles, tossing in a folk standard or a country tune among the rock songs. It was subtle, but those who paid attention noticed Graham's open-minded approach. He never believed genres should stay in separate lanes. In 1965, he pulled off something of a surprise by enrolling at Harvard University. The plan, at least nominally, was for him to study theology. Perhaps on some level he was seeking to make sense of the spiritual questions left by the tragedies of his young life. But Harvard couldn't hold him for long. He found himself seduced by the folk clubs around Cambridge and Boston, staying out late to absorb new music instead of reading for class. Before long, Graham dropped out and drifted south to New York City, where the Greenwich Village folk scene was a mecca for young dreamers. There, he tried his hand at folk music more seriously, formed a group called the Shilohs, and performed in coffee houses where audience members sat cross-legged on floors, hanging on every lyric of Dylan-inspired protest songs. The Shilohs never got famous, but that period was crucial in shaping Graham's sensibilities. He learned the power of raw, heartfelt storytelling. Even once he shifted more toward rock in the coming years, he carried that folk intimacy with him. By the mid-1960s, the American music scene was exploding. You had the Beatles and the Rolling Stones dominating the charts, while the radio played Motown hits, surf rock from California, and rebellious garage rock from who knows where. Traditional country stations stuck to the Nashville sound, a slicked-up, string-laden style that often felt disconnected from rural roots. Graham believed there had to be a way to blend the honesty and heartbreak of old-school country with the energetic surge of rock and roll, but he didn't see anyone doing it in a truly fearless way. That conviction led him to Los Angeles, where he formed the International Submarine Band in 1966. At the time, LA's musical tapestry was vibrant. The Byrds were pioneering folk rock, the Beach Boys were exploring lush pop with pet sounds, and the clubs on the Sunset Strip thrummed with psychedelic rock. Into this swirl stepped Graham, a slight southerner with a knack for bridging musical worlds. The International Submarine Band recorded Safe at Home, often hailed in hindsight as one of the first full-fledged country rock albums, though it barely made a commercial dent upon release in 1968. The album's blend of steel guitars and rock rhythms confused radio programmers. Was it country? Was it rock? They didn't quite know what to do with it, so they mostly ignored it. Despite the album's poor sales, it caught the attention of a few influential ears, among them Chris Hillman of the Byrds. The Byrds, one of the hottest folk rock bands in the country, were in a transitional phase. David Crosby had left, and the group was searching for a new direction. Graham joined the Byrds in 1968, and they famously traveled to Nashville to record what would become Sweetheart of the Rodeo. In the heart of country music's capital, these long-haired rockers tried to fuse pedal steel guitars and Merle Haggard covers with the shimmering harmonies that had made the Byrds famous. It was a bold move, one that alienated many country purists. When the Byrds played the Grand Ole Opry, they were met with a chilly reception from the conservative crowd. A notable moment came when the Byrds replaced their planned Merle Haggard cover with Graham's own ballad, Hickory Wind, live on stage without warning the show's producers. That move infuriated certain Opry executives, but it also showcased Graham's refusal to kowtow to tradition at the expense of artistry. Despite the forward-thinking ambition of Sweetheart of the Rodeo, the album flopped commercially. Byrds purists found it too country, while hardcore country fans saw a bunch of hippies treading on sacred ground. Even within the band, tensions bubbled. Graham's lead vocals were largely stripped from the final mix because of lingering legal complications with his old label. Then, a moral dispute sealed Graham's fate in the Byrds. The band planned to tour South Africa, which was then under apartheid. Graham flat out refused to go, leading to a fiery confrontation with Roger McGuinn, after which Graham left the band. This was a low point, but also a catalyst for a new project, the Flying Burrito Brothers, launched with Chris Hillman. In forming the Burritos, Graham saw a golden opportunity to refine the country rock blend that had eluded him so far. Released in 1969, their debut, The Gilded Palace of Sin, sparkled with steel guitar, swirling keyboards, and a loose, soulful vibe that was part honky-tonk, part cosmic trip. It remains a cult classic, praised for its innovative spirit. Unfortunately, the record didn't climb the charts. Rock listeners weren't sure what to make of a band in embroidered nudie suits singing about heartbreak, and country radio was no more receptive than before. The Burritos gigged in smaller venues than they'd hoped, dealt with poor promotion, and struggled to keep the band cohesive. Graham's own escalating substance abuse fueled conflicts and missed opportunities. Though Chris Hillman tried to keep things stable, Graham's erratic behavior became a major liability. By 1970, Graham was spending more time with Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones than with his own bandmates. He'd met Keith in Los Angeles just as the Stones were weaving country elements into their repertoire. Graham's encyclopedic knowledge of country music impressed Keith, who was dabbling in songs like Wild Horses and Dead Flowers. Rumor has it, Graham had a direct hand in shaping Wild Horses, suggesting a slower, more mournful approach that aligned with classic country ballads. While official credits never acknowledge Graham's contribution, Keith acknowledged in some interviews that Graham influenced the Stones' interest in country. Their friendship wasn't just about music, though. It was also about partying. Graham fell deeper into a cycle of heavy drinking, cocaine, pills, and eventually heroin. Meanwhile, the Flying Burrito Brothers started to fragment. Chris Hillman eventually had enough of Graham's unprofessional behavior and parted ways. By 1971, Graham was effectively adrift. No band, no stable home, no plan beyond chasing ephemeral creative sparks and the next high. He took a fateful trip to France, where the Rolling Stones were recording parts of Exile on Main Street at the Nelcote Villa. Official accounts remain murky, but some studio insiders insist Graham was around the sessions, informally nudging the Stones' approach on country-leaning tracks. Others say he was simply Keith's sidekick, too intoxicated to contribute meaningfully. Regardless, it's clear that his presence loomed large, at least in the personal orbit of Keith Richards. Back in the States, Graham needed a fresh start. By chance or fate, he crossed paths with Emmylou Harris, a gifted vocalist from Alabama who was performing in the D.C. area. Some say he first heard her at a local club in Washington, where her crystal-clear voice caught his ear. Others recall she had spent time in New York's folk scene, honing her skills. Either way, Graham recognized a rare talent. He reached out with a proposition: join him in Los Angeles to collaborate on a solo album. Emmylou, who was a struggling single mother at the time, saw it as a chance to break free from the grind of local gigs. That collaboration yielded 1973's GP, Graham's first solo album. The sessions brought together seasoned players like James Burton on guitar and Glenn D. Hardin on piano. Emmylou's harmonies added a new dimension to Graham's voice, almost like two sides of the same soul singing in unison. Tracks like She and A Song for You blended country pathos with a kind of wistful introspection that wasn't quite folk and wasn't quite rock. It was, in Graham's mind, the purest expression yet of cosmic American music. Despite glowing reviews from some critics, GP failed to make a commercial splash. Graham had grown accustomed to these letdowns, but they still hurt. He was pouring his heart and soul into music that the mainstream just didn't know how to process. Yet, he pressed on, enlisting Emmylou once again to record his second solo album, Grievous Angel, also in 1973. Those sessions were marked by a sense of looming tragedy. Friends recall a certain darkness in Graham's eyes, like he was running out of time. He'd show up to the studio with a cup of coffee one day, fully present, and then disappear on a drug binge the next. Emmylou tried to encourage his healthier impulses, to keep him tethered to the music that he said he loved more than anything. But addiction is a powerful force, and Graham was losing the battle. One of the lesser-known anecdotes from those sessions comes from a studio engineer who observed Graham trying to teach Emmylou the precise harmony line for a track. The engineer remembered Graham becoming teary-eyed, telling her something like, "If we don't believe every word, nobody else will." He insisted that each note be imbued with genuine emotion, not just technical skill. Emmylou would later describe Graham as the greatest teacher she ever had, not just musically, but in terms of heartfelt honesty, an approach that she carried into her own illustrious career. In the summer of 1973, Graham headed out to Joshua Tree National Park in California, a place that had become a kind of spiritual hideaway for him. He'd been going there for a while, drawn by the stark beauty of the desert and fascinated by stories of UFO sightings in the area. People close to Graham say he felt a cosmic pull in Joshua Tree, believing that under those vast skies he might find some resolution to his restless spirit. On September 19, 1973, he was staying at the Joshua Tree Inn when he overdosed on a mix of morphine and alcohol. He was only 26 years old, the same grim age that had already claimed Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin in the rock world. His sudden passing shocked friends, even though they'd seen him teetering on the edge for months, perhaps years. In a twist that feels almost scripted by Hollywood, Graham's friend and road manager Phil Kaufman, claiming it was Graham's last wish, stole his coffin from Los Angeles International Airport before the body could be shipped to Louisiana for a family service. Kaufman drove the coffin back to Joshua Tree, where he attempted a makeshift cremation, the incomplete burning left behind remains that authorities eventually retrieved, and Kaufman was fined for the theft. Whether Graham had truly asked for a desert cremation or whether Kaufman acted on a misunderstood promise remains a subject of debate. Either way, that final act cemented Graham's mythic status as a desert-bound outlaw poet, a cosmic wanderer who couldn't be confined even in death. Grievous Angel was released posthumously in early 1974. Critics who had largely ignored Graham during his life now sang its praises. Emmylou's harmonies sparkled alongside Graham's vocals, creating a melancholy beauty that caught the ear of a wider audience. In that sense, Graham Parsons finally began to receive the critical recognition he'd yearned for, but he never lived to see it. Emmylou Harris carried the torch forward, channeling Graham's spirit into her own successful solo career. To this day, she remains one of the most ardent keepers of his flame, often performing his songs and speaking about his lasting influence on her artistry. As with many legends who die young, controversies swirl around Graham Parsons' memory. One frequent debate is whether he truly invented country rock. Skeptics point out that Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and the Everly Brothers had been blending country and rockabilly long before Graham arrived. Buck Owens and Merle Haggard had integrated rock-like energy into the Bakersfield sound. Even the Byrds themselves had begun dabbling in country influences prior to Graham's arrival. His advocates respond that Graham was unique in consciously trying to erase the boundary lines to blend multiple genres, country, rock, gospel, R&B, into a single, all-encompassing sound. His approach was less about dabbling and more about forging a new identity. History, they argue, has vindicated Graham as a visionary who saw the interconnectedness in all these American musical styles. Another topic of debate is how substantial his influence was on the Rolling Stones. Keith Richards has alternated between praising Graham as a major inspiration and downplaying the extent of Graham's input. Given the haze of those years, fueled by substances and late-night sessions, it's challenging to pin down exact credits. Yet there is no denying that during the late 60s and early 70s, Keith and the Stones displayed a growing affection for country-esque ballads, and Graham was undeniably in their orbit, sharing old records, teaching chord progressions, and showing how certain country inflections could breathe new life into a rock melody. Regardless of official documentation, the intangible effect Graham had on the Stones is evident to anyone who listens to Wild Horses or Dead Flowers with an ear for that old country sorrow. Then there's the personal controversy, Graham's wealth, and the question of authenticity. Some old school country fans dismissed him as a rich kid slumming in honky-tonks. They saw nudie suits decked with marijuana leaves and pills as a cheap gimmick from someone who hadn't earned his stripes in the rough world of honky-tonk bars. But those who knew Graham personally attest that his love for country music was genuine, rooted in hours of studying the Louvin brothers, George Jones, and Hank Williams. He had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of country history and a real reverence for its emotional depth. He was a paradox, the rebellious trust fund kid who truly wept over country ballads, the high society boy who poured genuine heartbreak into every note. One friend recalled a night in Los Angeles when Graham, clearly under the influence, spent an hour in a corner of a club quietly singing gospel hymns to himself. When asked what was on his mind, he said he was thinking about his father's death and about how music was the only thing that ever made the pain bearable. Another anecdote involves a small bar in Bakersfield during a Burrito Brothers road trip. The band had an off night, so Graham jumped on stage unannounced to do a Buck Owens cover. By the end of the song, a few old-timers in the crowd had tears in their eyes, and they had no idea who he was. To them, it was just a soulful young man with a voice that carried genuine heartbreak. That kind of raw connection is precisely what Graham believed music was all about. The repercussions of Graham Parsons' work can't be overstated. Though his albums didn't chart significantly in his lifetime, they became foundational texts for a new generation of artists. The Eagles, arguably the biggest commercial success story of country rock, featured Bernie Leadon, who had worked with the Flying Burrito Brothers. Linda Ronstadt, who soared to fame in the 70s with a string of hits blending rock and country, openly credited Graham for showing how those styles could intertwine seamlessly. Later, Emmylou Harris brought country rock and folk influences into mainstream Nashville. By the 1990s, an entire movement called alt country or Americana, Uncle Tupelo, Wilco, Ryan Adams, Lucinda Williams, Gillian Welch, would cite Graham Parsons as a guiding light. Even if the mainstream pop country machine never fully embraced him, his fingerprints are all over the evolution of roots music in America. There are also intangible consequences to consider. Graham offered a blueprint for how an artist can wear vulnerability openly. He was never a showy vocalist, preferring to let the trembling sincerity in his voice carry the emotional weight. That approach, more than any nudie suit or rock and roll flourish, is what resonates with listeners today. He gave permission to countless performers to sing from the gut, to not worry about whether they were country enough or rock enough, but simply to tell the story that needed telling. Yet for all his influence, Graham's life is also a tragedy, a lesson in how early trauma and the allure of substances can derail even the brightest talents. He never reconciled the pain of losing both parents. He wove in and out of relationships, rarely finding lasting stability. Though he often spoke about cosmic connections and universal love, he was plagued by self-destructive behavior. By the end, it's as if the desert called him home, a final setting for a restless soul seeking peace he could not find elsewhere. One intriguing, rarely mentioned tidbit comes from his half-sister, known to family as Little Avis. She described Graham showing up at their home with a box of records, from Delta blues to classical orchestral pieces, insisting that his younger sister explore the entire spectrum of music. He told her something along the lines of, "You'll never find your truth if you don't open every door." That sums up Graham's philosophy. He had no patience for narrow definitions or genres. He believed that every form of music had a slice of the human story to tell, and that by merging these slices, we could capture a fuller picture of who we are. Graham Parsons' life is a tapestry woven from heartbreak, rebellion, invention, and a profound love for the stories that lie at the heart of American music. His journey was anything but neat or predictable, much like the blend of styles he championed. And though he left us far too soon, his spirit continues to roam. Maybe he's still out there in the desert of our collective imagination, strumming a guitar under the Joshua Tree stars, singing a ballad about heaven, earth, and everything in between. His voice, even now, beckons us to join him in that search for cosmic understanding, to dive fearlessly into life's contradictions, and to find our own truth in the songs we carry close. Thank you for wandering these roads with me. May Graham Parsons' legacy reminds us that the lines we draw between genres, between each other, can always be erased by a voice that dares to reach out, raw and unguarded. If you ever feel lost in life's desert, remember there's still a melody hidden in the wind, waiting for someone to sing it. Let's keep listening and keep an open heart because, as Graham tried to show us, our best chance at cosmic harmony lies in blending all the notes we've got until they resonate with the full range of our humanity. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.